In this particular lecture, let's go ahead and let's learn what is context in React. So what exactly is context and why it is used? So in order to understand what context is in React and how it works, and more importantly, why context is required, let's take an example. So whenever you design applications in React, typically you have a bunch of components. And what we do in a React application is that we have a bunch of data, which might be the state variables, and we also have functions which actually manipulate those particular state variables. Now, in case if you have data and functions inside component A, and if we have component B nested inside component A, and if we have component C nested inside component B, and if component A actually has the data and functions, and if you want to pass those particular data and functions to component C, we make use of props. So what we do is we create those data and functions in component A. Then we pass those data and functions as a prop to the component B, and ultimately from component B we pass them to component C, and we could actually use those data and functions inside component C. Now the problem with this approach is that even if component B does not actually need these data or functions, still we have to kind of pass those data and functions to component B so that we could take the data and components from here and then pass them to component C. Now this phenomena where you need to go ahead and take data and functions and you kind of have to pass those from one component to other and from that other component to other component, that particular phenomena is called as prop drilling. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. And the reason why we want to avoid prop drilling is because the components which actually do not need the data and functions still has to go ahead and accept them. So now we need a solution to this particular prop drilling problem. And that solution is to go ahead and create a context. So in case of context, what we do is we have data and functions, and we create data and functions in one of the components, and we kind of pass them to a context. And whenever some other component actually requires that data and functions, then we don't have to pass those from one component to other, but instead we could directly go ahead and access that particular context anywhere inside any kind of component which we have. So for example, if we have component A, component B, and component C, and if component C actually requires that particular set of data and functions, then component C can actually access those data and functions by making use of the context. So I hope this clarifies what exactly context is. So a context is nothing but it is something which actually allows us to access data and functions from one component to other without having to pass them through the components which do not require them. And the reason why we use context is to avoid the problem of this prop drilling. So now once we understand what exactly context is, now let's go ahead and let's learn how exactly a context is created in a React application and how it is used. So whenever you talk about context, there are actually 4 steps which we have to implement in case of a context. So the first thing is you actually have to create a context. That means you basically go ahead and create a context object which you could then go ahead and pass to different components. Then the next thing which you have to do is you have to provide that particular context. So let's suppose some of the components in your application require this context, then you take this created context and then you provide that particular context to the other components which require it. The third step then is to consume that context. That means, let's suppose if component C actually requires that context, then we basically make that component C consume that particular context. And by consumption of context, we simply mean kind of go ahead and take those datas and functions which are provided and then basically make use of those datas and functions over there. Then the final thing which we do in terms of a context is that we could update that context as well. So as I earlier mentioned, a context is nothing but it's data and functions. That means the data which a particular component consumes, we actually also have to go ahead and modify that data as well. So the final step hence is updating the context, wherein you take the data which was actually present in the context and then you update that data. So now let's go ahead and let's actually implement these things and learn how a context is created and how it is used. So let's implement context step by step. So the first step is to go ahead and create a context. So let's go ahead and let's create a context. So here I'm actually into my app.jsx file. And right now app.jsx is completely empty. So for now, what we will do is we'll go ahead and create some kind of a context here. So whenever you want to create a context, you simply make use of the create context method. So you say create context, and that's actually going to go ahead and create a context for you. So let's save this context into something. So let's call this as, let's suppose, user context. So let's suppose here in the context, we are trying to save data and methods or data and functions related to a user. So here I would say const user context equals this. So what this does is that it has actually created a user context for us. So that means now an object has been created, which is called as user context. So we are done with the first step of actually creating the context. Now the next thing which we need to do is we need to provide this context. Now the question is, what exactly providing context means? So providing context basically means once you have created the context which has data and functions, you basically go ahead and pass them to any kind of component which you have. So this particular process of actually providing context to a particular component is actually called as providing context. So right now we only have this app component here. So let's create another component here in the source folder. So I'll create a new component and let me call that particular component as a checkout component. So checkout.jsx. So export default function checkout. Let's make this thing return a div. And once we have that particular component, now let's assume we want to take this particular created context and we want to pass this particular context or provide this particular context to the checkout function. So how exactly would you do that? So in case of props, you would simply go ahead and pass this as props to the checkout component. But in case of context, you do something else. So in case of a checkout, what we do is we first go ahead and let's use the checkout component here inside our app. So let's use checkout. And if you go to the app right now, as you can see, you'll get a blank screen here. And that's because we have nothing inside this checkout. So let's actually type in checkout here. And now if I go back here, as you can see, it says checkout. Now we have the checkout component, which is embedded inside this app.jsx. Now the question is, how would you take this context and kind of provide this context to the checkout component? So this is where our second step comes into picture, which is for providing the context. So in order to provide the context, what we do is, as we want to provide context to this checkout component, that basically means, first of all, you have to go ahead and say user context, which is this context right here, dot, and this is going to be provider. So this basically creates a context provider which provides context to any component which is nested inside it. So once this context provider is created, you simply could go ahead, cut this out, paste it inside this context provider. And once you do that, that basically means this user context is now actually accessible to this particular checkout component which we have. All right, so once this context is provided, now we could go ahead and kind of pass in some value which we have to provide to this particular context. So as I earlier mentioned, every context which you create, that context basically can have a data and functions. So let's go ahead and let's provide some kind of a value here to this particular context which we have created. So in order to do that, here I would simply go ahead and say, all right, we have created this particular user context, and the value of this is going to be, it can be an object or it can be a string. So to keep things simple, I'll pass in a string. So let's say this user context contains information about the username of the logged in user. So right now, if nobody is logged in, let's say the by default user is guest. So that basically means creating a context. Then we have this checkout component, and we are basically providing the value of user context to this particular checkout component. So this right here is our second step, which is providing the context. And within the context, we are passing in the value as guest. So as we have now provided the value to this checkout component, now let's go ahead and let's try to access that particular value here. So if I go to checkout here, right now, if I want to access that particular value, here we now need to go ahead and implement our third step, which is to go ahead and consume the context. So consuming context basically means kind of like eating up the context which has been provided. So in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to use a use context function. So here I would say use context, and to this use context you need to provide the context which we want to use here. So our context is present in app.jsx and the name of our context is user context. So first of all we have to import that context here and then pass that context to this use context function. So here I would say, all right, I want to consume the user context here. So I would say user context, and if I do so, this is not being imported automatically, and that's because we have not exported this user context from here. So that's one more thing which you need to remember, that is whenever you go ahead and create some kind of a context, you always need to export that context as well. So I would say export const user context. This will give you an error. So let's create this context outside of this function, and once you do that, you're pretty much good to go. So now let me go ahead and use that particular context up over here. So here I would say user context, and I need to import user context from app.jsx. And now once we have this context value, let's save this value into something. So let's create a variable called as value. So const value equals use context user context. So once we have used the user context, now we have the value which is being passed here, which is this value of guest. So let's display that value here. So I would say value. So if I save this, go back here, it says checkout guest. So I could say checkout as guest. That would make it more appropriate. So as you can see, now we have done the third step as well, which is to go ahead and consume the context. So that means we are done with the third step, which is of consuming the context. Now let's go to the fourth step, which is to go ahead and update the context. Now let's say instead of having the hard-coded value of a guest, let's suppose we want to make this particular value of the logged in user to be dynamic. So in order to use a dynamic value here, we could make use of a state variable instead of this hard-coded value. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So up over here, I'll go ahead and create a state called as user. And along with the user, let's also have a set user function. Now I would say use state, and let's say the by default value of state is going to be guest. So now what I could do here is that instead of passing in the hard-coded value of guest, I could now instead pass in an object here. So I would say value equals an object, and in this object I would pass in the user state which we have. So I'll pass in user here. So now what happens is whenever we pass in user, the by default value of the user is guest. That value gets passed to the checkout component, and that value is going to be displayed up over here. But if I go back here, if I inspect this, I'll get an error over here, and that's because right now the value which we are getting here is actually an object, and earlier the value was a hard-coded string. So that basically means here inside this value we are getting an object, and we need to destructure that object, and from that object we need to get the value of the user. So over here I would say const destructure the user from the object which is being passed here, and then display the user here. So I hope this step actually makes sense. So if you do not understand that, let me go back here and let's keep this thing as value. And now as you can see, it's not working. But if I go ahead and say value.user, as you can see, it says checkout as guest and no errors would occur. So instead of doing something like this, I could directly destructure that value to user, and I could just pass in user here instead of saying a value.user. So it says checkout as guest. So we have the value of the state displayed here instead of a hard-coded value. But we have still not implemented the functionality of actually going ahead and updating the context which we already have. So once we have the state value here, we could now go ahead and update that value of state by making use of the set user function. So now let's go ahead and implement that. So in here, let's suppose we also have an input field which actually accepts the name of the user using which we want to log in. So here I would create an input field. Let me create that. Once I have the input field, let me set the value of this input field to the value of this state, which is user. So the value is going to be user. And I would also set the on change on this one. So whenever the input value on this changes, I want to change it to whatever value is entered by the user. So that's going to be set user, and set the value to be e dot target dot value, and that's it. So once we have this input field, now what I could do is I could go ahead and change the value of this input field to, let's say, Jake. And as you can see, if I change the value of this particular input field right here, what that basically does is that it will also change the value of the state, and the value of the state is nothing but user, and therefore this newly updated value is now also provided to this particular checkout component, and therefore the checkout component will now display that updated value for us over here. And all of this is possible because here, to this particular context, now we are actually providing a value of state, which is nothing but our data. Now let's get to the final point of learning how to create a context, and that is to be able to pass functions to a context as well. So as earlier discussed, whenever we are talking about context, as I earlier mentioned, context contains data and functions. So we have already learned how we have passed data to a context. So data right now is nothing but our state. Now let's also learn how we could go ahead and pass in a function as well. So in order to understand this, let's take another example, wherein let's suppose we also want to have a login form, and once that login form is submitted, we should be able to go ahead and change the value of this particular guest which we already have. So right now we are changing the value of the guest, and we don't want to change it this way. Like when I type something in like Mike here, I don't want to go ahead and change the value in this way, but rather than this, I actually want to have a form so that when I click on the submit button, the value of this state should change. So in order to implement this, let's go ahead and let's create a new component called as login.jsx. So login.jsx, export default function login, and let's suppose this thing returns a div. And in here, as this is going to be a login form, I would create a form here, which is our regular form component. Let's not have any kind of action here. And let's simply have an input field here, which is going to accept the username using which we want to log in. So this is going to be plain simple text. And then let's have a button which actually submits the action. So the button type is going to be submit, and let's say this button says login, and that's it. Now let's go ahead and let's create a state for this. So in order to create a state here, I would say const, and instead of saying user and set user, let's say we call the state variables as value and set value equals use state, and let's say the initial value of this is going to be empty. So I would set the input value to value here, and the on change on this one is going to be nothing but set value e dot target dot value, and that's it. All right, so once we have this particular login form, let me include that login form up over here. So what I would do is, instead of this input field, so let me first make sure that I get rid of this input field here, and over here I would create a login component, and that will add that particular form up over here. Now the job of this login function or this login component is to go ahead and change the value, which is the value of the user which we have. But right now there's one problem, and that problem is this context provider only provides context to the checkout, but it does not provide context to the login which we have. That means in order to provide this context to the login component as well, this login component actually needs to be inside of the context provider which we have. So once we have the login inside there, now we could go ahead and consume the context inside the login as well. So if you could go to checkout, we have used this in order to go ahead and consume the context. So we are going to do the same thing with the login component as well. So here I could go to login, and inside the login, I could say, all right, I want to use context. So I would use the use context hook, and I want to use the context which is user context. So I would say user context. It will automatically import that for us. And right now the user context only contains the value of the user. So here I would say const destructure it, const user equals user context, and that's it. Now, once we have the value of the user inside the login component, that alone isn't sufficient. And that's because when I hit this login button, I actually want to change the value of the state which we have, which is nothing but the user state. So in order to do that, or in order to change the value of the user state, we need to use the setUser method. So as I earlier mentioned, whenever we talk about context, a context can contain data and it could contain functions as well. So what I would do is I would take the setUser function and I would pass the setUser along with the user up over here. So I'll simply give a comma and I would say user and setUser. That means now these two components will now have access to the user data, which is the state, and it will also have access to this function, which is the setUser function. So our job is simply now to go ahead and use the setUser inside our login. So here we have gotten user from the user context. Now let's also get the setUser function as well. So once we have gotten access to that, we are pretty much good to go. So now what we have to do is, whenever we submit the form, we want to go ahead, make use of the setUser function to set the value of user to the value which is entered inside the input field. So here I would say, all right, when the form is submitted, so on submit, I want to execute the handle submit function. Now let's define that handle submit here. So function handle submit. And over here, I simply need to go ahead and first of all, prevent the default reloading. So e.prevent default. And the next thing which we have to do is make use of the setUser function. So setUser and set the user to the value which is being entered inside the input field. So the value inside the input field is our value. So I would simply say value, and that's it. So let's see how this would work. So right now, if I hit refresh, as you can see, there are no errors. And let's say I want to log in as Jake. So if I say login, as you can see, now it says checkout as Jake. And the way in which this is happening here is that we have this input field or this login form right here. And inside the input field, we are adding this string, which is Jake. So this is being handled by this input field. And whenever I submit this form, it is simply taking the setUser method, which is provided by the context provider, and it's setting the value of setUser to the value of this input field right here. And we are able to do so because we now have access to the user as well as setUser function inside the login component as well as the checkout component because of using the context provider right here. So this is how you could go ahead and create a context in React to pass in data as well as functions from one component to other without having to use any kind of props. So in the next lecture, we will learn how you could separate out the context which we have up over here inside this app.jsx into its own separate file. So let's learn about that in the next one.